I got to ask a question. What do you think of when you hear someone say the medieval world or the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages? What are just some ideas that kind of naturally pop up into your head? Got knights in armor. Got peasants, lots of peasants. We got what? The Renaissance Fair, yes. We get to relive it. Superstitions, okay. Anything else for medieval times, the Middle Ages? Definitely dragons come up in the repertoire there. When you research medieval Europe, you come across interesting things, lots and lots of interesting things. So how many of you have performed music at some point in your life? In some way, you have performed music in front of people. It's probably many of you, like if you were in a church choir as a child or you play up here. Tim, you'll appreciate this. Most musicians in medieval England were seen as rogues and thieves. And so they were only allowed to stay inside while they were performing, and then they had to sleep in the stables outside because that was just the impression that people had of these traveling migrant musicians. How about this? How many of you fought with your spouse or significant other this week? No, actually, don't raise your hand. I don't want to restart it, tear that scab off. But couples in medieval, what is now Germany, didn't waste time when it came to solving their disputes. Rather than just arguing like any normal couple, they took to the ring. Now, this is mind-blowing. I think my wife would appreciate this idea. Trial by single combat was a popular way to solve disagreements. And if it was a man and wife that had a disagreement, that trial by combat had some certain regulations. There were rules you had to follow. It's just not an all-out brawl. They would dig a hole, and the man would have to be a little bit deeper down than knee level. He's almost kind of thigh level down in a hole, and he has a club, but the woman gets to be outside in the ring, and she has some bags filled with rocks. And there are disputes on how it was actually settled. When do you know who won the argument? Some people had said every time the woman would land a hit on the man, he would lose one of his 3 clubs. And when all of his 3 clubs were gone, dispute was over. I've also read that sometimes they said that if the woman could get the man out of the hole, then she would be the winner of that argument. And so if you need a new way to solve marital disputes, dig a hole in the backyard, fill a sock with some nickels, and you just go after it. You just see what happens. There's interesting things in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. They're called the Dark Ages, contrary to popular belief. It's not because there was some kind of de-evolution down into just chaos and barbarism and a total rejection of education and we lost all these things. Some of that happened, but it's called the Dark Ages because we really just don't have a whole lot of really reliable sources about the time period. It was an unsettled time period, at least for the first 500 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. And so we call it the Dark Ages just because it's difficult to see into it. We have more insight into classical antiquity and early modern life than we do in this Middle Ages time period. But within 500 years of the fall of Rome, things had started to kind of coalesce back into some norms of societal order. And so we're going to talk about that time period in the development of Western civilization today. So let's pray. Father, you've been good to us in ways that truly we don't even understand. We look to you in the midst of suffering and trials and recognize in faith that you are doing more things than we could possibly imagine for our good and for your glory. Father, this is true throughout history. You move kings and you change governments and you change the landscape. Father, you do all these things for your glory. And we want to know your story. We want to know how you've worked in history. And so, Father, I pray that you'd help us today to have an insight into your work in history. We pray these things in your name. Amen. So if you would kind of just need a little bit of a view of where we are going. I'm sorry you guys on this side have to look over there. We're down a projector today. This is going to be like kind of the overview of where we're going over the next several weeks. We started talking about pagan Rome and then the influence of Christianity in pagan Rome, and we'll recap that in just a minute. Today, we're going to talk about the medieval world, and then moving forward, we get into Renaissance and Enlightenment. We talk about transcendentalism and modernism, and then finally the postmodern world. But I'm curious, can you notice anything different about the medieval time period as opposed to these other time periods? It's just a long time. We have a lot of years to cover in this class period this morning, and so by necessity, we just have to skim over the top. Look at kind of some dominant ideas in culture throughout this time period, but please don't think that today is going to be an exhaustive exploration of the medieval era. There is so much, and you can spend a lot of time, you can spend a lot of money, you can take courses, you can get a whole degree if you want in just medieval history. There's a lot here, and we're just going to skim over the top. But the reason for this is, as the rate of information transfer increases, well, change in culture happens faster. In the medieval time, change in culture doesn't happen quickly because the rate of information exchange is relatively slow. But as we get more and more towards the modern era, that speed of information transfer picks up, and people are able to make changes in governments and in societies on a much more quick basis than at any other time in history. So we are reminding ourselves why we're in this class. We want to just understand the development of Western worldviews from Rome until now, because that's going to give us an insight into our world and how to live in it as Christians today. We also want to make sure, now we covered this in our first class, just what a worldview is, that lens through which you interpret all the data that you get about our world. We want to be able to evaluate worldviews from a biblical perspective, so having that very strong biblical foundation to identify which ideas in these differing worldviews really go along with Christian doctrine and which ones don't. And then lastly, especially as we get towards the modern and postmodern eras, I'm excited for us to think and talk about ways that we can pursue redemption in our culture. We've been personally redeemed, but that's not the only part of the redemption story if you're a follower of Jesus. It's also about bringing God's kingdom and establishing it here. And so we're going to be moving in that direction as we go through the class. So last time we did talk about the impact that Jesus' followers had on Roman culture, and today we want to know what the medieval European landscape looked like. So just to recap, if you were thinking back to pagan Rome, you're thinking 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century Rome, you're thinking about these things. There is a plethora of pagan religions, and they were very kind of pluralistic. If you had a god that you wanted to worship, you just kind of bring him along and add him to the pack, and everybody's going to be okay with that as long as you still worship the emperor, who is sort of God's highest emanation of himself on this earth. That was the big deal for Rome. And the value of human life was really because if you were closer up to this some universal soul that sort of cast off its own emanations, the closer you were to that spiritual realm, the more value you had, and they just deemed that as a social hierarchy. The emperor was up near the top, and nobles and aristocracy underneath that, and you went further and further down, and by the time you got down to slaves, children, women, value was almost nothing. They didn't have a concept of innate value of human life. But into this arena, the idea of imago Dei shows up. From the Jewish faith system and then its completion in Christianity, the idea that man is made in the image of God utterly shook the foundations of pagan worldviews and the system of value that had been established over thousands of years. It's a groundbreaking idea. And so, regardless of social status, followers of Jesus, followers of the way, said every person has innate value that is equal before God. And it's hard to say how unique and groundbreaking that is, because that's the water we swim in. We're so used to that idea. Things that are so natural to us, like having equal standing before the law and basic human rights regardless of your position in society, private property and ownership rights, and representative forms of government, all of these things are rooted in that concept. And that's brand new stuff for first century Rome. So Christians made a big impact in Rome. They made a big impact. The worldview of Christianity started to spread, and they did things like this that would really turn the Roman culture on its head. They didn't participate in the games, except, unfortunately, sometimes when they were forced to fight in the Colosseum. But I did notice this. It was impactful, and there are accounts of this. It was impactful for a pagan world to watch Christians go into the Colosseum, be forced to fight for their life and die on that sand, and to do so singing hymns. To do so without really putting up a fight. That made a huge impact on the ancient pagan world, because people sitting in those stands thought to themselves, as they watched these Christians die, they thought to themselves, do I have anything that I believe in that strongly? Do I have anything that would uphold me in that situation? And many were forced to come to the realization that they did not. There was nothing that strong and stalwart in their lives. And that was a testimony to Christianity in that early time period. Christians rescued infants, mostly girls that were left out to die of exposure because Roman families had no desire to raise more than one girl. They wanted boys. And that helped the church grow, actually. They grew in that way. The Christians systematically opposed slavery. They bought slaves and freed them, made them part of their community, cared for them. They had a redeeming effect on their culture. They cared for those who were sick in plague years. They would go into plague homes when the doctors had said, nah, we're out of this one. We're not going to risk our own lives for these peasants. Christians said, we will. And they died alongside them. And the testimony of the gospel went out by these Christians living out this worldview that's based on Imago Dei. So we've seen that these generations of believers had a worldview that was rooted in reality, and the fact that they lived that consistently was a major influence in their culture. So now let's talk very briefly about the fall of Rome, which is really not something that you should talk briefly about. It is a pretty significant idea, but I'll give you just the very quick overview, and you could read hundreds of books on this topic. This is just a flyover of when we saw the Roman Empire begin to crumble and then kind of see its end, at least in the Western Empire. So reasons for the Rome's fall is you understand, we're trying to just move our timeline forward. We want to get to the modern era, but we need to see these divisions as we go along. So there was ungovernable expansion. This was an empire, but how many of you would say that you are in charge of something, or at some point in your life, you've been in charge of something? Anybody willing to say, yes, I have been in charge of people, I've been in charge of projects. Pretty much everybody has had that experience. And we know how difficult it can be to administrate, how difficult it can be to be an administrator, to try to get everything in order. I'll tell you, for the past 6 years, I've been in charge of a tiny kingdom of 18 to 23 seventh graders, kind of every day, period after period. And the administration in that situation, of that tiny kingdom, was challenging. At any given time, we were on the verge of a peasant revolt, or a revolution, a change in authority and leadership, or a famine, at least until snack time, which happened in second period because these little tummies were rumbling by second period, or a plague because somebody needs to teach these children to cover their mouths when they cough. My administration of that classroom had its challenges, even on a small scale. Imagine trying to be an administrator of this Roman Empire. It's a vast empire that goes from Britannia, right, the British Isles, all the way down, if you kind of are thinking through the map, from Britannia down through France and Spain, they would have said Gaul, and then across that Strait of Gibraltar and down into the northern coast of Africa and Mauritania, and it comes over and it goes to Egypt, and it passes Egypt and goes into Arabia and all the way over to what would today be Iraq, and then up from Iraq, into Assyria and that area. This is a massive empire. And administration of that empire is really challenging. There were corrupt and ineffectual rulers. I mean, you have to trust the people that are beneath you if you're going to administrate that kind of empire. And there just weren't a lot of ones that were doing the job right. Can you trust the people under you to not just try to enrich themselves, to not thwart justice when they get bribes, right? Those things happened all the time. And then I talked about this earlier, the rate of information transfer. This is a big one. The fastest journey from Jerusalem to Roma in this time period was about 28 days, assuming perfect weather, no issues on the way, smooth sailing through the Mediterranean and up, about a month to get information from Jerusalem to Rome. That's a long time if you're trying to administrate and react to different situations and be proactive to different uprisings. And you're not even going to know something's happening until a month after it's happened. And all of a sudden, that's really difficult to work with. There were also Germanic migrations. There's an influx of Germanic immigrants because they actually saw some of the benefit of the Roman system. And they're like, hey, we want to live there. There's protection, there's food, there's economy. But there's also an influx of Germanic tribes that would be attacking these different settlements of the Roman Empire, especially on their fringes. And so Rome's always trying to put out fires. They're always trying to, all right, we need to send troops out to this region because we're getting attacked over there, and then there's something else going on over here. And it's just ungovernable. There's a breakdown of trade because it's difficult to do trade with other nations when your borders are under threat. There's a reduced influx of slaves. Y'all remember Rome is a slave empire. It's built on slaves, and the reason they have so many slaves is because as the empire expands, they enslave those peoples. Well, as the expansion slows, the influx of slaves slows, and they don't have the basis of their economy and their infrastructure. They're not replacing their population, and they're not replacing population by procreation. We said that Rome was a very sexualized culture, but an anti-natal culture. Lots of sexuality, very few childbirths. That's just not what they were interested in, at least in the upper classes. There's also deurbanization and decentralization. As the empire starts to lose touch with some of its outer edges and start to try to pull itself in, well, those former Roman territories have to kind of fend for themselves. And people generally tend to move out of city centers and into the rural countrysides and become agrarian cultures. They had their own ruling councils in most of these, small rural areas. And so there's this just kind of loss of this idea of centralized Rome. Rome is in control. Well, not really. We got a town council, and the problem right now is our sheep have a disease, and so we got to deal with that. That's what life became as the Roman Empire starts to sort of fade away. And in that interesting shift where the Roman Empire is falling away and retreating and coming back into itself, the Roman Catholic Church really steps into a lot of those civil roles, right? So where there would have been Roman governors that are administrating towns and cities, they bail out. And who's already there with the education and the popular support and the administrative ability? Well, it's the church. It's bishops that have been appointed in these different areas to be, leaders of the Catholic Church. But now they're stepping into civil roles. And that's just a shift that happens during this time period, during the fall of Rome. If you want to see that idea of how significant the Roman Empire was at its height, this is what we're talking about. Trying to administrate that massive amount of land and people groups and different cultures and different languages, it's an administrative nightmare. And that's one of the reasons that they started to fail and fall. The borders shrank. Eventually, they tried to split it into an eastern kingdom and a western kingdom so that they could administrate it better, and it came back together, and then it split one more time for good in 395. I got to show you something very satisfying now. I hope that you'll find it satisfying. Y'all might have to click on that play button in the back there to get this one rolling. I think it's like 15,000 dominoes. I can't tell if you're as thrilled with this as I am. We are going to watch the whole thing, so just buckle up. So when we think of the fall of Rome, that's the picture I want you to have in your mind, because we have this tendency in our modern era to look backwards at history and go, here are these really clean dividing points, like this happened and this happened and this happened. And history is just not like that. It's usually, now there's a few times in history when this happened, but it's usually not clean breaks and clean changes. It's more like watercolors. If you've ever done watercolor and you put a brush stroke there and some of that color kind of blends over into some of the color that's next to it, that's really how history works. It's this blending from one thing to the next, or this process of kind of continual change. And so when you think of the fall of the Roman Empire, I want you to think of those dominoes. It takes a long time for everything to really fall and settle. And about the first 500 years, we date the fall of the Roman Empire to about 476, when one of the Germanic kings really deposed one of the major Western Roman rulers in Italy, and from that point, for about the next 500 years, it was this kind of chain reaction. This thing falls, and this thing falls, and this, and all the time, it's this process of change. So I hope that today it's not overly simplistic. By necessity, we have to be a little bit simplified in the way we talk about these things. But I want you to know there's a lot of complex interactions in all the different realms of society after Rome falls. But this at least gets us moving into our next era. So let's talk about the medieval era after Rome falls. And I want to talk about it in kind of three sections. We'll talk about education, economics, and politics, and be very brief to be able to end up saying, all right, well, zero back in on Christian culture. What was Christian worldview happening during this time period? So, can we get that next slide? Sometimes the video throws us off. Oh, look, Garfield. There we go. All right, thank you. So, medieval education. We'll just talk about these things and really just cherry pick a couple of ideas to get us to Christian worldview. And you'll see the Christian worldview kind of interspersed in here. Medieval education. Now, there was a decreased emphasis on education during the Middle Ages, and that's, again, kind of out of necessity. As cities sort of implode and the infrastructures go away and people sort of move out and spread out, these urban schools that had been developed in Rome for the good of the empire really don't have much of a purpose anymore. There's not people around them to go, and really we've kind of shifted from metropolitan life to survival mode. Now we've got to make sure that we're doing all the things we need on a daily basis to survive, because there's not the slave population is not here to provide all of that stuff anymore. So all of a sudden, school becomes not as big of an issue as it was before. That doesn't mean that we, again, lost all learning and education, but it does kind of get static for a while, this idea of education. The exception, though, is Ireland. And this, man, I wish we had time to just dive into this. This is a really cool section of history in Ireland in the 400s and 500s. So there are Druid religions in Ireland, these Celtic religions. There's human sacrifice. It's incredibly barbaric. There's nature worship, all these rites and rituals. You think of things like Stonehenge. But interestingly enough, the Druids were a group that valued education more than almost anything else. And it wasn't going to school and sitting down and taking notes. It was oral education. They were receiving information about rites and rituals, but also about the natural world, what they called natural philosophy, and also about history, and also about ideas of law. And all of these things were part of the Druid life. It was not easy to become a Druid. You had to do a lot of study and learning to become a Druid. So they had this kind of, underground idea of their own education. And then Patrick, we call him Saint Patrick. We have a celebration for him in America that doesn't have much to do with who he actually was. St. Patrick, who later was canonized by the Catholic Church, was, as a 16-year-old, Irish, he was living in Britain, and Irish raiders would regularly make forays over into the British Isles, and they would pillage, and they would take things and take people, and his village was attacked, and he was taken and made into a slave in Ireland, and worked in these very desolate regions as a shepherd in Ireland, as a slave of some notable tribal leader. He had a dream that a ship was ready for him to go, and he escaped. He escaped from that captivity after, I think, 6 years, escaped back to Britain. But then, and by the way, during his time in Ireland, he developed this fervor for his relationship with God. Because I don't know what else you do when you're sitting on a rocky cliff and you got all these sheep with you, and you got the North Atlantic Ocean there, and you're just kind of hanging out. He developed a fervent relationship with God. But when he got, rescued, he made his way back to Britain, he felt a burning call to go back to Ireland and to witness the gospel to the people that had burned his village, killed people that he knew, and taken him as a slave. He converted his enslavers. He went back, he converted his enslavers, and as these former Druids got saved, they carried their desire for learning into this new faith system. So they're like sponges. They just got greedy for information about Christianity and other things. And so these former Druids, now Christians, collected ancient texts. They collected manuscripts. They got really hungry for this area of learning, and so they started monasteries, and they preserved texts. They copied texts day after day after day, and Ireland is like this little shining light in the midst of the Dark Ages, where they were preserving so much history, so much literature, so much of the culture of even ancient Rome and ancient Greece, that it was almost like this was a place where Christianity exploded from. Because now, once they had all these Druids that were learned and had figured out this gospel thing, they started going out into the former Roman Empire and starting monasteries and starting schools. And so while most of the former Roman Empire was kind of devaluing education, the Irish are over here just making schools pop up all over the place and preserving the text and doing a service for all future people, everybody that would want to know these things. It was an astounding time in history. There's very little new scholarship until around the turn of the millennium because, again, most civilizations at this time, most tribes, most areas are focused on kind of survival mode, agrarian life. But then we see the rise of universities in the 1100s and 1200s, and a lot of them really can draw their roots back to the Irish Christians and the preservation of texts and ideas about learning. One other idea that shows up in medieval education is this idea of scholasticism, and it was really just, they had a worldview mindset because of Christianity that truth is knowable. It's not some mysterious thing out there that you have to rely on divine intervention to figure things out. It's that God is a rational creator, and He made this world to follow rational rules, and so you can discover truth if you work at it. And so this idea of scholasticism, they said you ask a question, right? You pose your problem. You list out all of the authorities in the past who have written about it, who have talked about it. You go find Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and you kind of compile the information that other people have said about it. Use Aristotelian logic to kind of work your way through your problem. And then you argue against your own answer. You try to come up with opposing viewpoints to really arrive at, have I answered this question thoroughly, and have I answered all the objections that somebody could bring to this question? And to be honest, this is still the basis for like graduate level work in universities today. If you were to write a paper in a graduate class, the first thing they make you do is go read everybody else that's ever written about this thing. Make sure that you know every argument that's already been developed so that you can kind of put yours in there and add to that conversation. So, medieval education, super quick overview. Let's go to medieval economics, just so you get an idea of how life is working for medieval Europe. It's a land-based economy, so land ownership is the thing. If you have land, you have wealth. That's part of the process. And there is this system called manorialism, from the word manor, a manor home, and some of you are familiar with that idea. But in manorialism, you have this system that kind of works hand in hand with feudalism. And maybe feudalism is the more common way to talk about this structure and this system. You can see it here. There is a king up at the top. So there is a monarch. There is a leading ruler somewhere in the land. It's not always going to be close to you, but somewhere in the land. And then he has these lords. They're vassals to the king. They're ones that really get land from the king. They're the manor owners, right? They're the ones who have big sections of land the king has given them. And then underneath them, they have these knights. They have a kind of a standing military that owes those lords allegiance, just like those lords owe the king their allegiance. And then on the bottom level is where most of us would have been. We are the peasants and the serfs who are paying rent in different sections of the manor to work the fields, but we get something out of that too. We get food and shelter for the rent that we pay to be part of that manor system. And these manor systems eventually grow into towns, and then they grow into cities, and this is where we see the development of the former Roman Empire back into urban settings, right? So we go from this agrarian setup back into urban settings over, the 500 or so years after the fall of the Roman Empire. You also will see the beginnings of capitalism in this situation as well. Things like property rights. Even the serfs and the peasants could not be kicked off of the land without due process. They have a pretty significant code of law that applies to even peasants and serfs, at least ideally. We know that these things are not always carried out well. Justice sometimes is perverted. But unlike a slave in a slave empire like Rome, these peasants and serfs, they kind of had a stake in what was going on in the manor system. Something else important in this culture that also applies to capitalism is that there was this idea of the inherent goodness of the physical earth and the inherent goodness of work. That's a concept that is disappearing in our culture. That work in and of itself, productive labor, is good. It is a good in and of itself. That was a key to medieval economics. We saw the rise of the guild system, where actually it's kind of like mediated capitalism, right? So in a town or a city, there would be different craftsmen who would make leather. This guy would be a blacksmith, silversmith, barrel maker. And after a certain amount of time, the population increased to the point where there was enough of these guys making these different crafts where they weren't just making them for consumption in their town, they were making them for export. And all of a sudden, this idea about the goodness of productive labor led to the creation of guilds where they said, hey, we got to make sure we have some quality control. If our town name is attached to these goods that are going out into the world, we want to make sure that we can be proud of the products that our town is producing and sending out into the world. So guilds were established, and they would set rules on like what kind of mixtures you would have to use in your paints and your dyes so that they wouldn't fade away after a couple of years. Like they were quality control for these different craft situations. Very quickly, let's talk about medieval politics, and y'all recognize we're just flying over some from his ideas. He wrote this book in response to pagans. There was like a pagan revival after the fall of Rome. There's a pagan revival because they go, Rome must have fallen because we stopped serving those old gods. and we started serving this Christian God. And Augustine said, no, it's not that you weren't Christian, it's not that you were too Christian, it's that you weren't Christian enough. That's the reason that it fell. And he said that there are two cities. There is a city of God, and the city of man is corrupted by original sin. He's talking about basic human nature, the doctrine of original sin. The city of man is not capable of not sinning. Sin is going to be rife in the city of man. And so government is a necessary evil. He's laying out economic and governmental policy. Government is necessary, but it is also evil. It's necessary because, well, there has to be a civil force that can restrain the evil in men's hearts. But it's also evil because who makes up the government? Fallen human beings. So he says it's a necessary evil. But then he says in the city of God, it consists of people who have regenerated hearts, who can not sin. They can choose to not sin. They can choose to be virtuous and follow Christ because of His Spirit. And they can live virtuous lives that are good even for the city of man. And so he saw this division between the carnal world and the spiritual world, the Christian world. And he said there can be some interplay. If you live well as a member of the city of God, it will be good for the city of men that you dwell in. And so he set out some ideas about government and the debate between church and state. And I will say this, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church grows in prominence and wealth and civil authority, and the result is that by the 13 or 1400s, the Pope is up here saying things that the Catholic Church believes are on par with Scripture. He's speaking for God, and that leads to corruption, that leads to abuse. By that time, the church is the state. And throughout the Middle Ages, we just see a lot of corruption happen in that Roman Catholic Church, that leads to, well, what will become the Protestant Reformation. The last thing for us today is to say, what is the influence of Christianity in medieval Europe? Well, I'm just going to take some ideas from Christian worldview and what they did in this culture. So, for example, original sin led to the idea of limited government. People are terrible. Our hearts are desperately wicked and sick, so we need checks and balances in governmental systems. And so there was an expectation for checks and balances. Kings had councils. A king was not a unilateral ruler. He had a council that he was kind of accountable to. In towns, there was a city council. There wasn't one person making all the decisions because of this idea of original sin. People are sinful. And so we have to have checks and balances in our governmental structures. The goodness of creation made them have an emphasis on the creation mandate. God told Adam to tend the garden before sin ever entered the world. Work is good. The physical world is good. And this flies in opposition to the Greek idea of dualism, where matter is evil, spirit is good, and so whatever we do on this physical world doesn't really matter that much. Well, Christians said, no, God created and it was good. So we have a responsibility to make it better. We have a responsibility to be farming. We have a responsibility for innovation, for science. We have a responsibility to create. We also saw in this medieval time period the idea of a rational creator. A rational creator. God created, and He's rational, and He created a world that follows rational laws. You can discover truth. This was not something that was very common in the ancient world. For them in the ancient world, it was more like, well, there are all these mysterious forces out there that we will never understand. The gods are responsible for them, and we just kind of pray and do our sacrifices. And Christians said, no, God is rational, and He made the world to operate in ways that we can understand it and take advantage of the laws that He has set in place. And so an increase in science and technology by observation of the natural world became a standard for Western culture. We also would see things like the goodness of work led to a focus on production and innovation, led to the beginnings of capitalism. Biblical finance, the guild system, this mediated capitalism where we wanted to make sure there was competition and it was fair, comes from this biblical worldview. And y'all, we'll always come back to this, Imago Dei. There's no idea in the Christian worldview that has made more impact than this idea that we are made in the image of God and everything that goes along with that. The responsibilities and duties that we have because of that, the rights that we have, natural rights that apply to all people, that's a Christian concept. The question you have to ask is, so what? It's a really quick flyover of medieval life, right? It's a lot of years in a little bit of time. So what? I want you to know this. Know that the foundation of Western civilization is Christianity. That is not a disputable fact. That is just a fact. Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization. It's very fashionable in our time to throw Christianity under the bus. You hear this in the news and the media all the time. Christians are bigots. Christians are small-minded. Christians are anti-science. Y'all, we're going to talk about this when we get to the Enlightenment and beyond. Christians are not anti-science. The reality is Western civilization is a direct beneficiary of Christian principles. The heights of Western civilization in art, in music, in architecture, these things are owed to the Christian worldview. Some of the greatest works of visual art and music and architecture have been artists' direct response to their understanding of God. The Sistine Chapel and the Hagia Sophia, Handel's Messiah, these things would not exist without the Christian worldview. The heights of the art world owe their abilities, owe their productive qualities to Christian worldview. The Western legal and political system that gives value to people regardless of age or position or sex, this is a Christian concept. We do have some skeletons in the closet. We recognize that. Christians have not always carried out this worldview well, but it is the foundation of Western civilization. Next one, think carefully and critically about the relationship between spiritual and civil authorities. As I look at the Middle Ages, I look at the growth of civil authority for the Roman Catholic Church, and I see corruption. Power corrupts. We see that when political motives overtake spiritual motives. That is a corrupting influence, and we have to be careful of that. That's not to say Christians should not involve themselves in politics. Christians have a responsibility and a civil duty to be lights, but I just want to say think carefully and critically about political motives and spiritual motives in our day and age. Power is a pitfall. Christianity has often done its most significant work far from the pedestal of power. That's a thing throughout Christian history. And the last thing I would say is this. Be encouraged that God is at work in history and not, hear me, not just in some grand meta-narrative viewpoint. God is at work in history through the redemption of individuals. He redeems people and gives them new hearts, and His kingdom grows. Why did Patrick go back and share the gospel with his enslavers? Because he had a change of heart. He had a regenerated heart and new affections and a sensitivity to God's leading. And so this one man, following God's call in his life, had a profound impact on history. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have a new heart. You have a calling to be part of this redemption narrative, to be part of the redemption of this culture, the building of God's kingdom. And so we have to figure that out. As we move on from the medieval era into more recent history, the question that we have to ask is, what is my